Picture a wall of green, not a forest, a fortress of vines, roots, and 100-foot trees pressing in on every side. Somewhere inside that wall, stone towers wait, half swallowed, their faces worn soft by centuries of rain. This is Angkor, once the beating heart of an empire that stretched across Southeast Asia, and once the largest city on Earth. When outsiders finally rediscovered it in the 1500s and 1600s, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. They guessed it must have been built by Alexander the Great, or by Romans, or by some lost race of giants. What they refused to believe, what seemed impossible to them, was the truth, that the people living in small villages nearby, the Khmer people of Cambodia, were the direct descendants of the very civilization that had raised these towers. So how did a jungle city of 1 million people rise to become one of the greatest powers on the planet? And how did it end up abandoned, wrapped in the crushing grip of banyan roots, its name forgotten for 200 years? That's the story of the Khmer Empire. A kingdom broken, and a man who rebuilt it. Long before Angkor existed, the lands of Cambodia had already seen empires come and go. An earlier kingdom called Chenla had once dominated the region, but by the 700s it had splintered into a patchwork of small, squabbling territories, many paying tribute to more powerful neighbors across the sea. Out of this fractured landscape came a man history remembers as Jayavarman II. We know almost nothing about his origins. No inscriptions boast about his childhood, no records explain where he came from. What we do know is that he chose his own name deliberately, borrowing it from the last king of the fallen Chenla Empire. It was a message. He intended to restore what had been lost. His military campaign in the early 800s was remarkably successful at first. Town after town fell in with him as he pushed from the southeast toward the northwest. But total unification wasn't achieved through the sword alone. When resistance stiffened and Jayavarman was forced to retreat into the rugged Kulin Hills, he realized that holding Cambodia together would take something more than armies. It would take an idea powerful enough to make rival lords stop fighting and start believing. That idea was kingship itself, reinvented. Jayavarman staged an elaborate Hindu ritual known as the Divaraja, the god-king ceremony, declaring himself not just a ruler but a living deity. We don't know the exact details of the rite, but we know its effect. Resistance across Cambodia melted away. Through a mix of this new religious authority, calculated marriages, and land grants, Jayavarman stitched together the first unified Khmer kingdom, stretching roughly from southern China down to the coast. The year 802 is generally treated as the empire's founding date. Every king who followed him for the next 500 years would perform the same ritual and adopt the same naming convention, a name ending in Varman, meaning shield. It was a dynasty built on the idea that its rulers were gods walking among men. The land that made an empire. To understand how the Khmer built something so vast, you have to understand the land itself. Cambodia sits along the Mekong River, one of the longest and most biologically rich rivers on Earth, fed by glaciers on the Tibetan Plateau thousands of kilometers away. At the country's heart lies the Tonle Sap, a lake so strange that it reverses its own flow twice a year. During the monsoon, the swollen Mekong pushes water backward into the lake, ballooning it many times its dry season size and flooding the surrounding land with mineral-rich silt. That flood was both a threat and a gift. It made the Tonle Sap one of the richest freshwater fisheries on the planet, and it created ideal conditions for growing rice, but only for people clever enough to control it. The Khmer became masters of water engineering, building networks of canals, dikes, and enormous reservoirs called barrays to capture monsoon water and release it slowly through the dry months. Some of these reservoirs were among the largest man-made structures on Earth at the time, built not by digging down, but by piling up earthen banks tall and wide enough to hold back small seas. This mastery of water meant Khmer farmers could harvest rice multiple times a year instead of once, producing a surplus large enough to feed a genuine metropolis. Layered on top of this were two more pillars of power: a king whose divine authority made service to the state feel like religious devotion, and a decentralized tax system built around local temples, where regional families competed to send tribute to the capital, fueling explosive economic growth. Together, these three strengths, divine kingship, a competitive temple tax system, and world-class water engineering, let Angkor swell to a population that may have reached 250,000 people at a time when London held barely 20,000. But each of these strengths hid a matching weakness, cracks that would eventually bring the whole structure down. Golden Age. By the 12th century, the Khmer Empire dominated Southeast Asia, and its architecture reflected that dominance. The most famous structure to survive is Angkor Wat, a temple complex so enormous it's sometimes called the largest religious building ever constructed, built from an estimated 10 million blocks of sandstone, quarried from hills more than 30 kilometers away, and floated down canals on barges. The stones were fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed. Angkor Wat was commissioned by King Suryavarman II, a ruler with grand architectural ambitions and, unfortunately, far less skill on the battlefield. He launched repeated invasions of the neighboring kingdoms of Champa and Dai Viet, modern-day Vietnam, and lost badly almost every time. These costly wars drained the treasury and destabilized the kingdom, and when Suryavarman died without a clear heir, Cambodia spiraled into decades of civil war. Things reached a crisis point when a rebel faction seized the throne, only for the neighboring kingdom of Champa to launch a devastating naval invasion. Cam ships sailed straight up the Mekong and across the Tonle Sap, catching the Khmer capital by surprise. Angkor was burned. Its temples were looted, its wooden houses destroyed, its people scattered. It was in the aftermath of this disaster that Cambodia's most celebrated king emerged, Jayavarman VII. A devout Buddhist who had spent years in exile rather than fight his own brother for the crown. He returned home in his 50s to find his capital in ashes. In response, he launched one of the most ambitious rebuilding campaigns in history, constructing an entirely new fortified capital, Angkor Thom, along with a vast network of roads, hospitals, and rest houses connecting every corner of the kingdom. He also broke sharply with tradition. Instead of declaring himself a Hindu god king, he made Buddhism the state religion and took the humbler title, the Lord who looks down. The cracks widen. Jayavarman VII's death around 1220 marked the last true golden moment of Angkor. What followed wasn't a single dramatic collapse, but a long, uneven unraveling. The religious shift he began had unintended consequences. Where Hindu god kingship had once bound the whole society together under a single, unquestioned spiritual authority, the empire's rulers now flipped back and forth between Hindu and Buddhist practice, depending on personal belief. That inconsistency eroded public faith in the monarchy itself. Into that vacuum spread a stricter, more austere form of Buddhism, one whose monks owned nothing, lived among ordinary villagers, and offered a stark contrast to the opulence of the royal court. It's not hard to see why this simpler faith appealed to peasants who had spent generations paying steep temple taxes and being conscripted into backbreaking labor gangs to build reservoirs and monuments for an elite class living in extraordinary luxury. At the same time, rival powers were rising on Cambodia's borders. The kingdom of Ayutthaya, in what is now Thailand, had once been part of the Khmer sphere but broke away and grew into a formidable trading power in its own right. Through the 1300s and into the 1400s, war between the Thai and the Khmer became almost constant, and it went overwhelmingly in Thailand's favor. Angkor's own road network, once a triumph of infrastructure that had supercharged its economy, now became a liability, letting enemy armies move quickly across the flat, exposed plains surrounding the capital. The city fell to a Thai siege in 1352, was retaken by Khmer forces, and finally fell again after a brutal 7-month siege in 1431. After that final blow, Khmer rulers relocated their capital south, closer to what is now Phnom Penh. Why the city emptied? For a long time, historians assumed some single catastrophe, plague, earthquake, all-out war, must explain how a city of hundreds of thousands could simply empty out. But modern research tells a quieter, more unsettling story. Sediment cores and tree ring records from the region show that Angkor's decline stretched across more than a century, not a single event. Tree growth in the area increased in the early 1300s as farming activity declined, and by the century's end, the great moat surrounding the city was choked with stagnant vegetation, a sign nobody was maintaining it anymore. The real culprit appears to have been climate whiplash. Tree ring data reveals that starting around 1350, Southeast Asian monsoon rainfall became wildly unpredictable, swinging between decades-long droughts and years of catastrophic flooding, some of the driest and wettest years of the entire millennium, compressed into just 100 years. Angkor's water system had been engineered for a relatively stable climate. When prolonged droughts hit, engineers hastily cut new channels to funnel every available drop of water into the city's reservoirs. But when the drought broke and heavy rains finally returned, those same emergency channels turned into floodgates, sending far more water into the city than its infrastructure could handle. Reservoirs overflowed, floodwaters tore through streets, and the very system built to sustain the city began actively working against it. Archaeological evidence backs this up. One bridge near the city's core appears to have been hastily rebuilt using mismatched stone blocks scavenged from nearby temples, a sign of a population in crisis, cannibalizing its own sacred structures just to keep infrastructure functioning. Eventually, even that wasn't enough. The bridge's foundation gave way as floodwater carved a new path around it entirely. Angkor's water network was so vast and interconnected that it needed a certain minimum population just to keep functioning, clearing silt from canals, repairing embankments, maintaining sluices. As war, taxation, and religious upheaval drove people away, fewer hands remained to do that work, which caused the system to fail further, which in turn pushed more people to leave. It was a downward spiral. Infrastructure and population declined, feeding on each other until the city could no longer sustain itself at all. The jungle returns. What followed was less a single abandonment than a slow bleed. Wooden houses rotted away within a generation or two, leaving only the great stone temples standing amid rising floodwater and creeping vegetation. Angkor was never truly lost, in the way legend suggests. Buddhist monks continued visiting its temples for centuries, and nearby farmers never fully vanished. But its identity as the seat of a great empire was gone, and eventually even its name faded from memory. Into that emptiness crept one of the jungle's most relentless organisms, the banyan tree. Its seeds, spread by birds, take root wherever they land, including on old stone. A banyan sapling growing on a temple wall sends roots down through every crack and joint, slowly thickening into wood, prying stones apart with the patient, unstoppable force of decades. Given enough time and no one to stop it, the tree doesn't just grow around a building, it consumes it. That's exactly what happened to Angkor. By the time Portuguese travelers stumbled onto its ruins in the late 1500s, this ancient capital had become something closer to a fossil. Astonishing in scale, wrapped in living wood, its origins so distant that its rediscoverers assumed it must have been built by anyone but the people who actually did. Angkor's story isn't really about mysterious ruins in a jungle. It's about how a civilization's greatest strengths, a centralized religious authority, an efficient tax system, brilliant water engineering, were also its greatest vulnerabilities. When climate, war, and inequality struck those systems at once, an empire that had stood for 600 years unraveled in barely 100. The stones are still there today, and so, in a quieter way, is the warning.